United States, long accustomed to dictating the rules of global finance, suddenly faces a coalition powerful enough to challenge its economic supremacy. This isn't a dystopian novel, it's unfolding right now. As of February 1, 2025, BRICS – Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE – controls 46% of the global GDP, 55% of the world's oil reserves, and 40% of international trade. Meanwhile, the US, under President Donald Trump, has threatened to impose 100% tariffs on BRICS nations if they dare to reduce their reliance on the dollar. But here's the twist. These threats might backfire spectacularly, accelerating the very decline they aim to prevent. Let's unravel how BRICS is rewriting the rules of global economics while the US clings to a crumbling status quo. If the United States thought its dominance over the global financial system was unshakable, the rise of BRICS has proven otherwise. Over the past 5 years, this coalition of emerging economies has executed a masterstroke in economic diplomacy, reducing the dollar's share in their cross-border trade from 67% to 55%. On the other hand, Washington's response, a mix of tariff threats and dismissive rhetoric, has only exposed its anxiety. In reality, BRICS isn't merely challenging the dollar, it's constructing an alternative financial ecosystem that could redefine wealth and power in the 21st century. Take the energy sector, for instance. BRICS members now produce 44% of the world's crude oil, with Saudi Arabia and the UAE joining forces with Russia and Iran. This isn't just about controlling resources, it's about leveraging them to reshape trade dynamics. When India buys Russian oil in rupees or China settles gas deals with Iran in yuan, they're bypassing the dollar entirely. These bilateral agreements, once fringe experiments, have become systemic. In 2024 alone, BRICS nations conducted 40% of their intra-group trade in local currencies, up from 28% just 2 years prior. For the US, which still relies on the dollar's monopoly to enforce sanctions and influence markets, this shift is existential. Yet the Biden administration's approach, dismissing BRICS as a non-threat, has given the bloc room to grow. By the time Trump re-entered office in January 2025, BRICS had expanded to 11 members, with Indonesia and Nigeria signaling interest. This isn't random expansion, it's strategic. Each new member brings unique strengths: Saudi Arabia's oil reserves, Indonesia's demographic dividend, Ethiopia's strategic location in the Horn of Africa. Together, they form a supply chain behemoth, from Brazilian soybeans to Chinese semiconductors, that rivals the G7. Meanwhile, the US remains trapped in a cycle of protectionism, threatening tariffs that could inflame domestic inflation and alienate neutral nations. The irony is palpable. Trump's ultimatum, commit to the dollar or face 100% tariffs, assumes BRICS nations have no alternatives, but in reality, they're creating them. BRICS Pay, a unified payment system set to launch in late 2025, aims to bypass SWIFT, the dollar-dominated messaging network for cross-border transactions. Pilot tests in Russia and China have already processed billions in ruble-yuan settlements. Similarly, the New Development Bank, NDB, has issued $30 billion in local currency bonds since 2023, funding infrastructure projects from South African ports to Indian solar farms. Compare this to the IMF, which still imposes austerity measures and dollar-denominated loans on struggling nations. Critics argue BRICS lacks cohesion, a valid point. India and Brazil have resisted a common currency, fearing Chinese dominance. But this diversity is also a strength. Unlike the Eurozone, which forced disparate economies into a rigid framework, BRICS allows flexible arrangements. India trades with the UAE in rupees, Russia settles with China in yuan, and Ethiopia barters coffee for Iranian oil. This mosaic of deals undermines the dollar's universality without requiring a centralized alternative. Meanwhile, the US struggles to reconcile its own internal divisions, with Trump's tariff threats conflicting with Treasury Secretary warnings about destabilizing the bond market. The human cost of this transition is staggering, but not where you'd expect. While Trump claims tariffs will protect American jobs, economists warn they'll spike consumer prices. 40% of US imports come from BRICS nations: iPhones from China, pharmaceuticals from India, crude oil from Saudi Arabia. A 100% tariff on these goods could double inflation overnight, eroding wages and savings. Meanwhile, BRICS nations are cushioning their economies through mutual support. The Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA, expanded to $250 billion in 2024, offers liquidity during currency crises, a safety net the IMF rarely provides without strings attached. Technological innovation is another frontier. While the US invests in AI and quantum computing, BRICS is pioneering financial tech. China's digital yuan, used in $300 billion worth of transactions in 2024, integrates seamlessly with Russia's Mir payment system. India's UPI, processing over 12 billion transactions monthly, is being adopted in ASEAN nations. These systems aren't just convenient, they're designed to exclude the dollar. When a Malaysian tourist pays in Mumbai using QR codes linked to rupee ringgit exchange rates, the dollar becomes irrelevant. For the US, whose tech giants still rely on dollar-based cloud infrastructure, this is a silent revolution. Environmental policy further highlights the divergence. BRICS' new development bank allocated 60% of its 2024 budget to renewable energy, funding Brazil's wind farms and South Africa's hydrogen hubs. The US, meanwhile, has rolled back climate pledges under Trump, opting to subsidize fossil fuels. This isn't just ecological, it's economic. As the EU's carbon border taxes loom, BRICS' green investments position them as leaders in the sustainable supply chains of tomorrow. The US, clinging to oil risks, becoming a high-cost outlier. The geopolitical chessboard reveals deeper shifts. By welcoming Iran and Saudi Arabia into the fold, BRICS has neutralized a decades-old rivalry, stabilizing oil markets. Ethiopia's membership strengthens China's Belt and Road presence in Africa, while Indonesia's entry counters US influence in the Indo-Pacific. Even Europe is hedging its bets. France attended the 2024 BRICS summit as an observer, signaling discontent with NATO's Trump-era turbulence. The US, isolated by its tariff bluster, watches as BRICS brokers peace deals and trade pacts without Western mediation. Labor and demographics add another layer. BRICS nations account for 60% of the global workforce, with India and Ethiopia contributing millions of young workers annually. While the US faces a demographic cliff, its median age 42 versus India's 28, BRICS leverages this youth dividend through skilling initiatives. The bloc's 2025 summit in Brazil will focus on AI education and cross-border remote work, areas where the US lags due to visa restrictions and protectionism. But let's be clear. BRICS isn't altruistic. China's debt-trap diplomacy in Africa and Russia's arms sales to Iran underscore the bloc's contradictions. However, these tensions are managed through a non-interference principle absent in US alliances. When India clashes with China over Himalayan borders, trade continues uninterrupted, a pragmatism the US, with its values-driven foreign policy, struggles to emulate. The cultural dimension is equally transformative. Bollywood films, K-pop, and Turkish dramas dominate BRICS streaming platforms, challenging Hollywood's soft power. Universities in South Africa and India now rival Ivy League institutions in AI research, attracting global talent. This cultural and academic rise complements economic strategies, creating a holistic alternative to Western hegemony. In contrast, the US's cultural exports are increasingly politicized. Disney's struggles in China and Netflix's censorship battles in India reflect a broader disconnect. While BRICS nations harmonize entertainment and education with strategic goals, the US grapples with domestic culture wars that spill into foreign policy. The 2024 US election epitomizes this decline. Trump's focus on tariffs and Biden's tepid response reflect a leadership vacuum. Meanwhile, BRICS summits showcase coordinated agendas. At the 2024 Kazan summit, leaders launched a joint AI ethics framework and ratified a climate adaptation fund. The US, by contrast, hasn't passed a major trade pact since Trump killed the TPP in 2017. Financial markets sense the shift. Gold purchases by BRICS central banks hit record highs in 2024, a hedge against dollar volatility. Cryptocurrency usage surged in Argentina and Nigeria after their BRICS accession, circumventing dollar-based capital controls. Even Wall Street titans like BlackRock are diversifying into yuan-denominated assets, anticipating a multipolar currency world. Yet the dollar's demise is overstated. 65% of BRICS reserves remain in dollars, and the yuan constitutes just 3% of global payments. However, momentum matters. Every bilateral deal, every digital yuan transaction chips away at dollar dominance. The US, reliant on seigniorage and treasury sales, can't afford complacency. What's next? If BRICS stabilizes local currency exchange mechanisms and expands BRICS Pay, the dollar could lose its reserve status within a decade. For the US, this means higher borrowing costs, reduced sanctions efficacy, and eroded geopolitical influence. For the Global South, it promises autonomy, but also risks dependency on China's agenda. In conclusion, BRICS isn't just crippling the USA. It's offering a blueprint for a post-dollar world. Whether this leads to equitable multipolarity or new hierarchies depends on BRICS' ability to balance ambition with inclusivity. One thing is certain, the era of American unipolarity is ending, not with a bang, but through 1,000 currency swaps. The US can adapt or fade, but the clock is ticking.